Thank you very much. Now, of course, in 2021, there's virtually no part of any of our lives or business activity which has not been touched in any way by climate change. We'll be exploring these changes in the course of this series, from nature's displacement of persons, be they hundreds or hundreds of thousands, to farming, to the challenge of deciding who should implement climate adaptations, and more importantly, at what cost. But first, let's take a look at the big picture.
The biggest problem now facing the world is climate change.
Climate change, an existential threat to not only the environment, but to the economy.
We are on the verge of the abyss.
Climate change has drastically altered what used to be somewhat steady, predictable weather patterns for hundreds of millions of us. But things are changing. And as you will see shortly, they're not changing for the better. The last 10 years have been described as a decade of exceptional heat. Those are not my words, but that's the description used by the World Meteorological Organization. 2020, you see, was one of the 3 warmest years on record. It was just after 2016 and just barely ahead of 2019. But these are dry numbers. It's one thing to say, here's the data. It's another thing entirely, though, to actually see and be subject to the effects of these changes. For millions around the world, this is not just dry numbers on an Excel spreadsheet or in a United Nations report. Take Sudan, for example. That country received some pretty heavy rainfall in 2020 that raised the Blue Nile to levels not seen in a century at around 17 meters. Water levels, in fact, had risen to a point where the pyramids of Meroe, these are structures that are over 2,000 years old, face the very real threat of being flooded and possibly irreparably damaged. With over 2 million hectares of farms flooded, over 1 million tons of grain destroyed, the extreme weather combined with the worst desert locust invasion in decades has left nearly 10 million people in Sudan deeply food insecure. But there was severe flooding in other parts of the continent too. The Niger River, for example, in West Africa, that also rose to record levels. With that much water sloshing around the continent, that also amplified yet another problem. The worst desert locust invasion that the Horn of Africa has had to deal with in decades, in some countries' cases in almost a century. Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, they all still continue to struggle with that problem, even in 2021. By the end of November, there were 30 named storms in the North Atlantic. That is the largest number so far on record. According to Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, the estimated damage that you could essentially put in monetary terms attributable to natural hazards last year alone was on the order of $210 billion. That's essentially like taking the combined GDP of Kenya and Ethiopia and destroying that just through natural causes and nothing else. In financial circles, this has led to another emerging problem. In order to limit a rise in global average temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, it essentially implies that a lot of oil and gas resources have to remain in the ground. But if you're a country that's heavily reliant on oil and gas revenue now, like Nigeria, or in the future, like Uganda, then these assets, as the Bank for International Settlements puts it, may suffer from unanticipated, sudden write-downs, devaluations, or conversion to liabilities. Put another way, these oil and gas assets may become worthless a lot faster than expected. But this then also raises another related argument. If oil and gas assets need to remain untouched and in the ground, then whose oil and gas assets should remain untouched? Should it be Nigeria and Angola, whose greenhouse gas emissions are nowhere near as large as those of the United States, which is among the top 3 oil producers in the world? How do you make that choice? That's just one of the many knotty questions that countries must tackle ahead of the UN Climate Change Conference later this year in November. In the meantime, though, the damage being inflicted by climate change continues. In 2019, tens of thousands of Kenyans living close to the shores of lakes in the Rift Valley were displaced by steadily rising water levels. From Lake Bogoria to Baringo to Naivasha, the rise of these lakes has been relentless, even today. As CGTN's Nick Mudimba now reports, experts are warning that this trend may not ease in future.
Early 2019 was tough for many near the Rift Valley lakes. Families were displaced due to the surging waters from different lakes. Businesses were shut, schools closed, and human-wildlife conflict took a different turn. It wasn't. This is Lake Baringo, one of the two freshwater lakes in Kenya and part of East Africa Rift system. The situation here hasn't improved and schools have been forced to move for safety. The water levels have surged to abnormal levels. Many residents who were born and raised in this area are still surprised. What was once their beauty and pride has now become a tormentor.
I've lived here all my life, and at one time the lake was about 3.5 kilometers away from where we're standing. It was all dry. That's in the 90s, early 90s.
In the lake, the threat is visible. Crocodiles are now closer than ever. The risk is clear. Just a few meters away, we spot a fisherman. His facial expression summarizes dejection. The amount of fish has greatly reduced, affecting their sole economic activity, and the well-being is shaky.
There was so much fish on this lake before, but now things have changed. There is no fish. Fishing frequency has reduced now. I only fish twice a day.
This school is one of the learning institutions in this region that was affected by the flooding waters. The evidence of its existence is all clear.
It's been more than 1 year since the students in this class enjoyed the comfort in their studies. But right now, the climatic change wrath took no prisoners and had to build on a higher ground for them to continue with education. The hope right now is actually just to pray that the waters will actually subside for them to come back and enjoy their education.
Climatologist Jackson Kenyanjui is a PhD student taking agricultural meteorology and climate change at the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. He is also the founder of Climate Change Kenya.
The Rift Valley comes from a depression because first and foremost, the Rift Valley was formed through the tectonic activities. It moved. And science has shown that these tectonic movements actually move at a rate of these plates. They are separating at 1 centimeter every year. And the tectonic movements that we are exhibiting right now are in regard to one, we have the Nubian plate moving to the west, and we have the Somali plate moving to the east. They are all separating from the Arabian plate. So all these plates, once they are moving apart, expect that there is underground water. First of all, you have to notice that the earth is made up of 70% water. And in this 70% amount of water, not all of it is on the surface. We have underground water. So this underground water, some of it is stored in the aquifers. So once these tectonic plates start moving, expect this water now to come onto the surface. So that's now we see there's a surge in the increase in these water levels in this lake. Some of it is coming from underground.
Other causes include humanity use of fossil fuel, deforestation, increasingly intensive agriculture, global warming, waste disposal, among others. Climate change, biodiversity loss, waste and pollution are some of the pressing issues Kenya took to the floor of the United Nations Environment Assembly in February. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Baringo, Kenya.
From East Africa, let's head south. South Africa is the most industrialized economy on the continent, but it's also the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in Africa. Over 90% of the electricity generated and consumed in the country comes from coal-fired power plants, and 2 of those, in fact, Medupi and Kusile, are among the 10 largest in the world. CGTN's Sumitra Naidu takes up the story.
South Africa is responsible for half of Africa's total carbon emissions. That's because 90% of electricity in the country is generated from coal. Eskom, though, has been included in government's plans to reduce emissions.
In the context of our history and where we're going to in the future, what's important to bear in mind is that the coal plants that are contributing to the emissions were built many, many years ago. And so we see that as we shut down those plants now and start to replace them with lower carbon technologies, we will have a positive impact on the NDC targets and our contribution to the Paris Agreement. I think our role is very pivotal and key to South Africa achieving its NDC targets.
The long-term emissions pathway will see South Africa's emissions peak, then begin to plateau before eventually dropping down to net zero emissions by 2050. But the strategy also concedes substantial and rapid emission cuts are required. However, it comes with risks to economic growth and sustainable development. Shutting down coal means investing heavily in renewables and cutting jobs. There's an estimated 82,000 people working at the mines, with an additional 50,000 in companies that burn coal.
We see a lot of opportunity coming in the development of renewable technologies themselves, where there's potential to create a large number of jobs through the value chain of renewable energy development, especially if we do renewable energy at scale. There's a huge potential for us to manufacture solar panels, but also on the wind side, things like the gantries, like the poles, the towers, all of those things that you need. There's a possibility for us to manufacture in the country. So yes, there will be job losses, but there will be job creation.
Several old coal-fired powered stations are due to be decommissioned over the next 10 years as part of South Africa's new climate strategy. But its success will depend on political will and deep pockets.
All lenders and investors must urgently end financing for any new fossil fuel projects, and they must implement plans to responsibly phase out financing to existing fossil fuel projects. Because every single fossil fuel project that is currently planned or under development is decreasing our chances of reaching the goals of Paris.
Parliament is expected to adopt higher ambitions for South Africa's emission reduction contributions in line with the Paris Climate Accord by June, ahead of COP26. A new Presidential Commission on Climate Change has also been established to ensure the country makes the changes that are needed. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
So then, from South Africa, let's head west. With per capita carbon emissions of barely 0.7 tons back in 2017, Nigeria's emissions are a fraction of other countries on the continent. The equivalent figure for South Africa in that year was 12 times higher. Now, despite its small emissions footprint, Nigeria has seen a steep rise in extreme heat and accelerated desertification. The latter is partly responsible for exacerbating the conflict that we're seeing between pastoralists and farmers, especially in the country centre. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmus with that story.
This seaside community in Lagos is a clear example of the visible impact climate change is having on Nigeria. The Alpha Beach community is rapidly being submerged because of rising ocean levels in this part of Lagos, threatening this community of over 10,000 people. In the north of the country, desert encroachment and drought are driving people further inland. This often leads to clashes between farmers and pastoralists who are in search of water and pasture for their herds. Analysts blame it all on climate change.
When we have this long series of droughts, the soil, thickens, and if eventually it rains, rather than the soil absorbing the water, that will be difficult because of the hardness of the soil. So the water will not be able to percolate and it begins to flow, and that creates a flash flooding, which is what we've been having in the Middle Belt.
This is a common sight in Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta. Gas flaring is a huge environmental challenge in the region. Data from the country's National Oil Spill Detection and Response Agency, NOSDRA, shows that Nigeria flared 1.7 billion cubic feet of gas between 2012 and 2020, valued at $6 billion.
The impact of gas flaring is very, very significant. It is a waste of resources. In one of the reports of the World Bank, it was explicitly reported that the gas being flared is enough to power the whole of the African continent.
Gas flaring and oil spillage combine to make Nigeria's Niger Delta region one of the most polluted places on the planet. The government had targeted to end gas flaring last year, but it missed it. leaving the country to aim for the 2030 target of the Paris Accord. It's also facing challenges in addressing the devastation caused by oil spillage in the Delta region. But the government is driving a campaign for cleaner energy. It's pledged to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2030. It's also launched an ambitious plan to have 1 million cars run on gas by the end of this year.
Nigeria will champion those initiatives that will surprise the rest of the Africans. Just keep your fingers crossed in the next few weeks as you see some more initiatives that are coming from the Office of the Federal Minister of Environment in tackling climate change beyond what we know.
There is indeed a gravitation towards cleaner energy in Nigeria. More solar panels are popping up on rooftops across the country. The government itself has launched a massive solar power project aiming at 5 million solar connections for off-grid communities. A local automobile firm recently unveiled the first locally assembled electric car in the country. So everything seems to be coming together as Nigeria shifts towards cleaner energy. But then, a lot of work still lies ahead. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Let's head over to North Africa. People living along Tunisia's coastline are increasingly becoming vulnerable to rising sea levels. Increasing coastal erosion and warmer sea waters are also threatening habitats that are vital to sustaining human activity and marine biodiversity too. As CGTN's Adin Chuachi now reports, for a country where 1 in 10 people are employed in the tourism sector, these changes are a significant problem.
Hassan is a fisherman in the city of La Goulette in northern Tunisia. He was born and raised near the port, where he now earns a living through fishing. Hassan says climate change has had a negative impact on his work.
Fish populations are declining and fish food is becoming rarer as the sea warms. Some species have disappeared from this area over the past 4 decades. They were replaced by some invasive species. The decline in the size of fish is also noticeable, while the quantity is very limited.
Experts have warned that diseases affecting some marine species are spreading. Many traditional fishermen fear they will lose their main source of income due to climate change.
Climate change is impacting fisheries. The local economy depends on fishing. Thousands of jobs could be lost if the state doesn't act quickly.
The country's Secretary of State of the Sea says climate change poses a major challenge. The Tunisian government has launched several projects to protect sandy beaches and coastal aquifers.
The state is providing the necessary means and financial resources to protect the coastline and the population, especially fishermen who depend on the sea. In addition, Tunisia's coastline has a huge potential for the development of the blue economy. There is an urgent need to build the marine ecosystem's resilience against climate change.
A recent study by the Tunisian Union of Agriculture and Fisheries has revealed that climate change has affected some fish species that have shifted away from shallow coastal waters, where temperatures will increase fastest, into deeper, cooler waters. The partnership between the Department of Maritime Affairs and several international organizations, as well as the civil society, aims to improve livelihoods on the coastline. Tunisian authorities have urged Mediterranean countries to cooperate in order to limit the impact of climate change. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
And that story from Tunisia, a country on the shores of the Mediterranean, wraps up this snapshot of how climate change isn't just changing government policy. It's changing how we do business. It's changing our daily lives across a continent that's home to over 1 billion people. As the Paris Climate Agreement turns 5 this year, the question of what is the ideal adaptation path and who will bear the costs of that adaptation still remains. Back to you in studio.